Have you ever wondered why a man seems to remember the woman he couldn't keep more vividly than the one he married? It's not a coincidence. It's not nostalgia. It's not even love, not in the way most people understand it. It's the haunt of the feminine mystery. Not the woman's body, not her voice, not the scent that lingers on the collar of his coat. It's the energetic echo of something he never fully understood, something that slipped through his fingers like smoke just when he thought he'd grasped it. And once it's gone, the male psyche doesn't just miss it. It obsesses, it mourns, it mythologizes, because what haunts a man is not simply her absence, it's everything unresolved within him that she once illuminated. Carl Jung taught that every man carries within him the image of the anima, his inner feminine. She is not flesh, but soul, not touchable, but sensed. And when a man meets a woman who unknowingly matches the contours of that internal image, he projects her onto her. She becomes the mirror, the muse, the storm. Not for who she truly is, but for what she awakens. But projection, by its very nature, is an illusion. And eventually, when she walks away, silently or with fire in her eyes, it is not just her departure he feels. It's the collapse of his illusion. You see, some women don't just date a man. They disrupt him. They touch the archetypal strings beneath his rational world. They awaken the shadow, the parts of himself he has disowned, his fear, his weakness, his longing to be chosen, his mother wound, his hunger for validation, his shame, and then they leave. Not with cruelty, but with a kind of sovereign silence that says, I see you, but I cannot carry what you refuse to own. And this is the first feminine mystery, the woman who leaves not out of drama, but from a place of painful clarity. She doesn't try to fix, she doesn't try to explain. She simply stops fighting for the potential of a man who won't fight for his own wholeness. And in doing so, she becomes unforgettable. Because the male psyche is built not just to conquer, but to resolve. And you, unknowingly, became an unresolved story. He will wake up years later and remember the sound of your laugh. Not because it was melodic, but because, for one suspended moment in time, he felt seen. Not as a role, not as a performer, but as a flawed, trembling being who mattered. But here's the second mystery. It is not the woman's presence that haunts him the most. It's how she made him feel in her absence. When a woman with deep feminine energy pulls away, she doesn't leave a void. She leaves a mirror. And men, Jung said, fear mirrors. Not the physical ones. They fear the psychic ones. The ones that show them who they have not yet become. The Stoics warned of this too. Epictetus once said, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. But most men, raised to suppress vulnerability, would rather lose love than be seen as weak. And so, when she leaves, it is easier to say, she was too much, than to admit, she saw too much. You see, most women don't realize the psychological earthquake they cause simply by refusing to shrink. A woman who stands in her truth, even when trembling, is dangerous to a man who hides in performance. She is a challenge to his false self, a threat to the ego identity he's curated for the world. Because her energy says, I don't need what you pretend to be. I crave what you refuse to become. This is the third mystery. Feminine presence is not a performance. It is a force. You do not need to raise your voice to be heard. You do not need to beg to be chosen. The mere act of being, in truth and integrity, in radiance, disrupts the boy in a man who has not yet initiated himself. He may label it too emotional. He may accuse you of drama, but beneath his words is fear. Because when a woman loves with intensity, it exposes his inability to receive. And when she walks, without blame, without a final plea, it confirms what he always suspected. He was not ready for her honesty, not ready for the depth, not ready to be fully seen, and not ready to do the work his soul craves. In Jungian terms, she becomes the carrier of the animus returned. She becomes the figure that calls him back to his unconscious, the one he buried under success, sex, and survival. And though he might replace her body 100 times over, her energy becomes the blueprint against which all others are measured. A man doesn't always know this consciously, but he will find himself staring at strangers, chasing echoes, wondering why he still dreams of her name. She didn't manipulate, she mirrored, she didn't dominate. She dismantled his defense mechanisms by simply refusing to tolerate half-hearted presence. And here lies the fourth mystery. She didn't ask him to become a better man. She left, and in doing so, forced him to ask if he was one. This haunts the psyche more than any romantic memory. Because when a woman departs not in anger but in full awareness, she forces the masculine to confront what no applause, no conquest, no sexual experience can soothe, the truth of who he is when no one is watching. And this is what breaks him open. Not every man will rise. Some will collapse into addiction, ego, distraction, or indifference. But the rare few, the ones brave enough to feel the ache she left behind, they will begin the descent, down into the shadow, into their fears, their father wounds, their need for power, their buried grief, their split between performer and protector. And this descent is sacred. It is not a punishment, it is a calling. Because only after he's been dismantled by the mystery of a woman who refused to shrink can a man start to integrate. Only then can he stop chasing images of love and start building something worthy of the divine feminine. He doesn't know it yet, but the silence she left behind is not empty, it is alchemical. It is the space where illusions die and truth begins. This is the sacred silence that Jung wrote of when he spoke of the negredo, the blackening, the dark night of the soul that must precede transformation. And the man, now stripped of the external symbols of validation, must face the raw ache of his emotional dependency. This is the fifth mystery. Her absence forces him inward. No longer distracted by the dance of seduction, no longer soothed by her presence, he finds himself in a room filled only with himself. And the silence is deafening. Not because she abandoned him, but because without her, he must confront the parts of himself she once carried. His unresolved grief, his unmet need to be mothered, his fear of not being enough, his failure to listen, his obsession with being right rather than being real. And this is the turning point few recognize. The woman did not break him. She broke the illusions he used to survive. And somewhere in the middle of one quiet night, as he scrolls through memories or sits in a room filled with strangers who don't see him, he will feel it. That ache, that pulse, that ancient whisper of the soul that says, "You are not who you came here to be." In this way, she becomes the initiatrix, not through sex, not through sweetness, but through absence, through removal, through her refusal to remain a container for his unprocessed pain. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." And what do you think happens when his thoughts revolve, day after day, around a woman who embodied mystery, authenticity, and quiet power? She becomes myth, she becomes muse, not for her body, but for her boundaries, for the way she walked away not to punish, but to preserve her essence. This feminine detachment is misunderstood. In a culture that glorifies chasing, fixing, pleading, her withdrawal is often labeled cold. But true feminine detachment is not cold, it is sacred. It says, "I see your wound, but I will not let it consume me." It says, "I feel your longing, but I will not lose myself to validate it." And this is the sixth mystery. She did not leave to be loved more. She left because she loved herself enough to know when to go. Do you understand the power in that? Do you know what it does to a man when a woman walks away not in hate, not in bitterness, not in blame, but in deep, quiet knowing? It haunts him, because now, for the first time, he sees the truth he tried to deny. She didn't leave because she was unstable, emotional, or demanding. She left because he refused to rise, to show up, to speak truth, to heal. And this is why he returns. Months later, years later, sometimes never in words, only in dreams. He returns not to possess her again, but to reconcile the wound she revealed. The seventh and final mystery is this. The woman he once thought he could own becomes the woman who teaches him freedom. Because when the feminine rises in her sovereignty, she becomes a portal, not to comfort, but to awakening. He may never tell her, he may never find the words, but he will carry her for a lifetime, not because he lost her, but because she forced him to find himself. And now, she is not just a memory. She is myth, an archetype, the one who walked into his life like a mirror and walked out like a sword. And the truth is, she was never his to keep, because she belonged to herself first. She belonged to herself first. This truth echoes through the deepest chambers of his psyche, like the sound of a bell long after it's been struck. The resonance lingers, shaping the way he sees every woman who follows her. And though their voices may be sweeter, their presence warmer, their bodies more willing, none of them carry her storm. This is not flattery. It is not romanticism. It is psychological law. What is repressed returns with symbolic weight. And in Jung's map of the unconscious, the anima becomes more demanding, more complex, the longer she is denied integration. She becomes both seductress and sage, both lover and destroyer. She takes on the faces of many women, but she always leads back to one, the one who saw him and walked away. Not out of cruelty, not out of abandonment, but because she refused to keep dancing in the masquerade of his half-truths. This is the confrontation men dread the most, the confrontation with realness. The kind that doesn't flirt or entertain or pacify. The kind that doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't demand. The kind that simply is. And when a woman like that turns her back, she doesn't vanish. She distills. Into the lines of a poem he can't finish. Into the pause in his voice when someone asks if he ever truly loved. Into the way he avoids eye contact when her name arises in a story. He tells himself it was timing. He tells others she was difficult. But the truth he avoids is darker, and it lives inside his own shadow. She showed him a version of himself he wasn't yet man enough to meet. This is why her memory does not fade. The body forgets, but the psyche does not, especially when the psyche is cracked open. And she, unknowingly, was the one who cracked it. She touched the fault lines that were always there, the ones carved by mother wounds and patriarchal masks and the endless pressure to perform. She saw his boyhood defenses, the way he deflected with charm, masked fear with dominance, replaced emotional truth with intellectual noise. And she called it what it was. Not out loud, not always in words, but in the way her presence withdrew when he chose ego over authenticity. This kind of feminine energy terrifies the unready man. It is the equivalent of being undressed in public, not physically, but spiritually. She sees the rot behind the smile, the tremble behind the pride. She recognizes it, not because she's psychic, but because she has met her own shadow and refuses to dance with a man who hasn't met his. This is the archetypal split. The woman who has become whole cannot long remain with the man who chooses fragmentation. And yet, paradoxically, it is her wholeness that draws him back. Not for her, but for what she represented. Integration. The sacred marriage of light and dark, of softness and steel, of nurturing, and truth-telling. And so, in his quieter moments, he will begin to question. What would have happened if I had listened? What would have changed if I had let her in without needing to win? What kind of man would I be now, had I not feared her intensity, but bowed to it? These questions do not come at the peak of success, nor in the arms of a new lover. They come when the lights go off, when the applause fades, when the distractions dissolve. They come in solitude. And this, too, is sacred, because solitude is the fire in which the false self burns. Seneca once wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." And the man who was once held by a woman in her power, only to lose her through his own blindness, will at some point realize how much of his life was spent avoiding the very work that could have healed him. She didn't demand that he be perfect. She only asked that he be real. But realness is terrifying to the man who has built his worth on applause, affirmation, and performance. He may claim to love depth, but when depth looks him in the eyes and asks him to bleed, to feel, to stay, he runs, until she's gone, and then begins the spiral, not downward, but inward. Her departure was not the end, it was the initiation. Because in Jungian psychology, the anima is not here to make a man feel comfortable. She is here to transform him, to lead him down into the underworld of his own denied soul, where every mask must fall. And you, were the mask breaker, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with presence, with boundaries, with the unbearable honesty of a woman who knows her worth. And so the echo of you lives on, not in nostalgia, but in awakening. There is a moment in every man's life when he realizes that the woman he lost was never asking for too much. She was simply asking for what he was afraid to give. And in that moment, something shifts. The stories he told himself to justify the loss begin to unravel. The jokes, the blame, the distance, they crumble under the weight of a single haunting truth. She loved me with a depth I wasn't prepared to receive. But by then, the energy has shifted. The woman has evolved. And what once could have been healed through presence and honesty now exists only in memory and longing. This is not punishment, this is consequence. And in the realm of the unconscious, consequences are not cruel, they are exact. Nature, the psyche, the universe, they all demand balance. And when a man refuses the call of growth, when he denies the mirror of the awakened feminine, life does not let him forget. It stores the image. It waits. It returns again and again until the lesson is learned. She becomes his sacred echo, not because she wants to be remembered, but because she once embodied something he cannot yet recreate. She didn't come to complete him. She came to reveal him. And revelation is never comfortable. Do you know how many women shrink their power just to be held a little longer by a man who cannot meet it? Do you know how many stay, dimmed, thinking that if they love him enough, he will one day rise? But the awakened woman knows, love is not supposed to wound your essence. It is supposed to sharpen your discernment. And so, she leaves, not because she stopped loving him, but because she finally remembered to love herself more. This is the paradox that twists in his gut. She didn't leave out of hatred. She didn't leave out of spite. She left with grace, with tenderness, with the kind of silence that only women who have suffered deeply can carry, and that silence is what haunts him most, because in it, he sees all the words he never said, the apology he swallowed, the truth he avoided, the vulnerability he buried under sarcasm. And now, it's too late. She is gone. Not just physically, energetically. She has closed the loop. And when a woman does this, when she ceases to leak her energy into a man who won't contain it, it creates a void in him that no distraction can fill. Other women will try, but their affection will feel flatter, easier, more palatable. Not because they lack worth, but because they have not yet demanded his. You see, the woman who leaves and means, it becomes the blueprint for the man's future evolution. Whether he accepts it or not, she becomes the symbol of his unchosen path. And the psyche remembers symbols more than facts. He may forget your birthday, he may forget the conversations, but he will remember the way your presence made him question himself, the way your eyes cut through his bravado, the way you could sense his chaos even when he wore control like armor. You didn't need to say a word, you knew. And when he pushed you away, or pulled you in only to push you away again, it wasn't because he didn't care, it was because he did. But care, untransformed, becomes control, desire becomes fear, longing becomes avoidance. And so the dance begins. The push and pull of a man who wants your light, but can't yet handle the mirror that comes with it. You didn't break him. He broke himself trying to tame a woman who wasn't meant to be owned. And now, in the quiet aftermath, as he sits alone with his own reflection, he understands the true cost of denial. It wasn't losing you. It was losing the version of himself that you once believed in, the version he never became. And this is the core of Jung's shadow work: integration. Not performance, not pretending, not becoming what others expect, but the slow, painful process of becoming whole. The woman who walks away becomes the guide, not through hand-holding, but through detachment. Her love was the fire, her leaving was the spark. And now he burns. He may call it regret, he may call it fate. But deep down, his soul knows, she was the turning point I missed. There is a peculiar kind of ache that follows a man after a woman like that leaves. It doesn't roar, it lingers. It isn't loud, but it reshapes everything. And no matter how much he distracts himself, that ache doesn't leave until he turns toward it, until he stops blaming her, until he finally realizes, she wasn't too much. She was the measure of everything I wasn't ready to be. It's here that the deeper work begins. Not in his next relationship, not in some self-improvement podcast or a motivational seminar. It begins in the silence of self-confrontation. Because now, her presence lives inside of him, not as a fantasy, but as a call, a psychic summons, a reminder that he once stood in front of something sacred and failed to bow. And this is the weight that no drink, no job, no conquest can erase. She didn't curse him. She didn't shame him. She didn't make herself smaller to make him feel more secure. And this is precisely why she is unforgettable. The awakened woman becomes a threshold, a rite of passage. She is the test the ego fails, and the soul never forgets. You see, in mythology, the sacred feminine often appears in the form of a mystery, a sphinx, a siren, a goddess in disguise. She does not explain herself. She does not chase the hero. She waits. And the man who seeks to possess her, rather than understand her, always loses her. Jung knew this well. He understood that what men often mistake for loss is actually initiation. The pain of her absence is not just grief, it is a reckoning. It is the soul's cry for integration. It is the moment when the man must finally stop projecting and begin embodying, because no woman can save him from his shadow. Only he can walk into that darkness and claim the parts of himself he once disowned. And it is here, amidst the ashes of the relationship he sabotaged, that he begins to ask new questions. Questions that are no longer about her, but about himself. Why did I feel the need to control what I loved? Why did vulnerability feel like weakness in front of her? Why did her strength threaten me instead of inspire me? These are not casual questions. These are thresholds. And the man who dares to answer them does not stay the same. The love he once feared becomes the mirror he must now earn, not through grand gestures, but through inner transformation, through emotional courage, through truth. This is the alchemy of feminine detachment. It does not destroy a man, it reveals him. And in her absence he is given a choice, to regress into bitterness and blame, or to rise, slowly, painfully, into a version of himself that could have met her where she already was. Many won't, most won't, but some will, and when they do, they begin to walk differently. They speak less to impress and more to connect. They begin to understand that love is not conquest, it is communion. That devotion is not submission, it is sacred presence. And still, she may never return. Because the work was never to win her back. The work was to become the man he was too afraid to be when she was still within reach. This is the feminine paradox. She is both invitation and departure. She is the storm and the stillness. She loves with a fire that warms and burns. And when she walks away, she does not close the door. She opens one within him, the one that leads home, to himself. This is what haunts him, not her body, not her voice, but the version of himself she once awakened, and the silence she left behind to let him find it on his own. She didn't abandon him, she freed him, and whether he ascends or remains in the ruins of what could have been is no longer her burden to carry, because she has already become what she was meant to become, a mirror, a mystery, a force of nature that came not to complete a man, but to challenge him to complete himself. Somewhere along the path of that man's unraveling, a profound truth begins to take root. She was never his to possess, only to meet. And that meeting, brief or prolonged, chaotic or sacred, was never random. It was the convergence of two timelines, hers ascending, his resisting. The universe does not play with these encounters. They are designed, timed, tailored to the exact wound that must be touched in order for a man to awaken from the trance of performance. And in her, he saw the impossible, a woman who did not need him to become whole. She wanted him, yes, at moments, perhaps even craved him, but she never needed him, because she had already walked the valley of her own fire. She had met her own shadow. She had kissed her pain in the dark and risen not as a girl longing to be chosen, but as a woman who had already chosen herself. This is the deepest threat to a man who hasn't met his own reflection. He cannot manipulate a woman who knows the terrain of her own mind. He cannot dominate a woman who doesn't equate presence with worth. He cannot gaslight a woman who trusts her intuition more than his words. And so what does he do? He resists, he withholds, he projects, he runs. Because when the awakened feminine appears, she brings with her not just the sweetness of connection, but the demand of truth. And for a man still living through his mask, that is unbearable. So she leaves. Not in drama, not in anger, but in sovereignty. And from that day forward, something ancient is stirred in him. Not desire, not nostalgia, but ache, the ache of the unfinished, the ache of the mirror shattered too soon, the ache of the man he might have been had he chosen to rise instead of retreat. And that ache does not go away. It lingers through successes that feel hollow. It whispers through new relationships that feel too easy. It surfaces in moments of silence, when the world quiets and the soul speaks, because that's when he remembers not just her, but himself in her presence. She did not make him powerful. She revealed where he gave his power away. She did not give him value. She showed him the cracks in the walls he built to hide from his own vulnerability. And now, long after she's gone, he's haunted by a single image, not of her body, but of her gaze. That quiet, knowing gaze that saw through every mask, every excuse, every unspoken fear. It was never judgment. It was invitation. The question is, did he accept? Or did he run from the one thing that could never be faked, being seen? You see, the feminine mystery is not in her beauty, not in her curves, not in her words. It's in her presence, her stillness, her unwillingness to abandon herself for approval. That's what shakes a man at his core. That's what stays long after the texts stop, the calls end, and the bed grows cold. She didn't play games. She didn't manipulate. She knew. She carried the wisdom of centuries in her bones, the heartbreaks of generations in her silence, the unspoken prayers of every woman who begged to be loved without losing herself. And she chose differently. She walked away when most would have stayed. She held her ground when most would have bent. And now, she lives in his mythology, not as the one that got away, but as the one who got real. The one who taught him, through her absence, what no presence could have ever achieved. That love is not comfort, it is transformation. That connection is not convenience, it is confrontation. That devotion is not submission, it is sovereignty shared. And unless he meets her in that sovereign space, she will always be just out of reach. Not because she's withholding, but because she has ascended. Because a woman like that does not return to the places that require her to shrink. She does not beg for apologies from men who still worship their wounds. She does not settle for being remembered when she is meant to be matched. He may see her again, in a dream, in a memory, in a woman who carries a fragment of her essence. But it will never be the same, because she is no longer the same. She has become what she was always destined to be. Not someone's partner, but her own foundation. Not someone's lesson, but her own liberation. And that is the final haunt. Not that he lost her, but that she found herself without him. There comes a time, inevitably, irrevocably, when the man stops chasing women and starts chasing meaning. When the noise dies down and the flurry of surface validation loses its thrill, he finds himself standing face to face with the hollow echo of every time he turned away from intimacy masked as inconvenience. And her memory becomes more than a name. She becomes a presence, a feeling, a sacred ghost of who he could have been had he dared to meet her where she stood, unapologetic, untamed, unbearably real. He tries to replace her, yes, not out of disrespect, but out of desperation. He surrounds himself with women who admire his image, not his essence. Women who soften their truths to accommodate his ego. Women who mistake his charm for integrity and his consistency for depth. And still, the void remains. Because no one told him. A woman in her power imprints the soul, not the body. And what she gave him was not just connection, it was initiation. He may never put it into those words, but his body remembers. His energy remembers. The way she didn't flinch at his anger, the way she didn't chase when he withdrew, the way she loved him, deeply, but not blindly. She demanded his fullness, not his fragments, his presence, not his potential. She didn't ask for a man who had it all figured out. She asked for a man who could stay in the fire of her truth without trying to extinguish it. And when he couldn't, she left, not to wound him, but to witness herself again. That moment, her departure, becomes the psychic fracture where his ego splits and the soul starts to rise. It doesn't happen all at once. It rarely does. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes heartbreaks. But eventually, the projection wears thin, and he realizes she wasn't holding a mirror to his faults. She was holding a torch to his becoming. This is what Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And she, unknowingly, made his darkness conscious. She didn't just reflect his desires, she reflected his wounds, his avoidance, his hunger to be needed without being known. And when she walked, she didn't just leave his life, she left a trail, a map, a riddle, one that can only be solved by the man who is ready to shed the mask and bleed for truth. Most won't, but some will, and the few who do, they begin to understand her not through memory, but through mirroring. Every time they choose truth over performance, presence over pride, stillness over seduction, they step into the man she once believed he could be, not for her, but for themselves. Because the deeper truth is this, she was never the goal, she was the reminder. The soul-stirring, ego-shattering reminder that love is not safe, and it was never meant to be. That the feminine is not a fantasy, it is a force. And that to love a woman like that requires a man to descend into the depths of himself and emerge, not as her savior, but as his own. He will look back, eventually, and understand why she had to leave, why she could no longer carry both his potential and her peace, why her silence wasn't rejection, it was protection. And he will stop asking why she didn't fight harder, because now he knows. She fought every day just by staying as long as she did. And when she left, it wasn't out of exhaustion, it was out of clarity. She saw what he could be, but she stopped needing to wait for it. And so, she became the storm that passed through his life and rearranged everything, not by force, by truth. And truth is always disruptive before it's liberating. There will be moments when he thinks of her, not in longing, but in reverence, not in regret, but in recognition. That woman, mystery and fire, wild and soft, unrelenting and kind. She wasn't too much. She was the mirror of his not enoughness. And in that knowing, he will either rise or remain haunted. Because the final lesson is this: you cannot unknow the woman who showed you who you truly are. And once her light has touched your darkness, you will never again be satisfied with shadows. And so the final reckoning arrives, not with fireworks, not with collapse, but with a quiet inner nod to the truth he ran from all along. She did not abandon him. She released him to himself. In the story that plays behind his eyes when the world is quiet, she no longer appears as the antagonist or the fantasy. She appears as the threshold, the feminine gatekeeper who refused to be tamed, who would not stay in a love where she had to shrink, who stood as both invitation and consequence. She was not asking for perfection, only presence, not a savior, only a sovereign. And now she lives in the corners of his choices, not as a ghost to chase, but as a compass to follow. Not because she is the destination, but because she awakened the path, the real path, the sacred path, the one that begins not when he wins her back, but when he reclaims himself. For the woman who haunts him is not a woman who begged, not a woman who clung, not a woman who sought approval or sacrificed her soul for companionship. She is the woman who stayed with herself, even when it cost her everything. She is the woman who walked alone, not to prove strength, but because it was the only way to remain whole. And that is what he will remember long after names are forgotten and memories fade. That in a world of women who molded, she remained untamed. That in a sea of sweetness, she was sacred salt. That in a culture that rewards accommodation, she stood rooted in revelation. She will not return, not because she holds bitterness, but because she no longer holds the resonance. You see, energy never lies. And a woman in her truth knows when the frequency is shifted. She knows when her light is being drained. She knows when her softness is being mistaken for silence. And she chooses peace over potential, freedom over fantasy, alignment over attachment. Because a woman like that does not seek to be remembered. She seeks to remember herself. And when she does, when she steps out of the illusion and back into her own soul, she becomes untouchable, not in distance, but in depth. The man may still see her, in passing, in dreams, in another woman's eyes, and wonder, how did I let that go? But the answer isn't in her. It never was. It's in the part of himself he refused to meet, the wound he masked with charm, the shadow he buried under performance, the boy he never dared to grow into a man. She left not to punish, but to preserve, not to vanish, but to vibrate higher, and in her wake, she left him a choice, to remain in longing, or to rise in remembering. And if he rises, truly, deeply, with humility and courage, he may one day meet her again, not as the one who was once unready, but as the one who has returned to his center, not to reclaim her, but to thank her. Not all stories are meant to continue. Some are meant to awaken. And the woman who walks in mystery, who loves from depth, who leaves in truth, she is not a chapter. She is the revelation, the closing of a cycle, the burn before the bloom, the memory that does not fade, because it was never just memory. It was a mirror, and the mirror never lies. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.